Hello, I am the Reading Rainbow Emperor, and today I'm going to be answering a question from a good friend of the channel, uh, who is such a fan of Hunter x Hunter that he is an association. Don't you think, he says, comparing the best of the past to the average of the now is unfair in a way? The answer is no, but yes, depending. First, I'm only really talking about Western media and not manga, anime, etc. Comparing Legend of the Galactic Heroes to Western works only because it is a written medium and it is science fiction. However, it's also excellent. So nobody really minds the comparison of excellent, relatively hard space opera to other space operas because space opera is its own thing. Second, I want to be clear. No, all works in a genre are comparable to all other works within a genre to a point. All steampunk books may be compared to all steampunk books, etc. Now let's compare something that's different but within the same basic genre of science fiction. Journey to the Center of the Earth and The Mote in God's Eye don't quite work as comparisons. They are different stories with different purposes and different ideas. The only similarities are the relatively hard science fiction, the solid philosophy, and the academic characters. And there's a lot of differences. Mote in God's Eye is a more, by Jerry Parnell, by the way, one of my favorite books of all time. Um, Mote is more military sci-fi. It's about first contact and it's set in space. And that's kind of just the big three. Journey to the Center of the Earth is academic sci-fi. It's about exploring our Earth and myth. It's set under the Earth. And comparing the two are apples to oranges. They are both fruit, and that's kind of it. The experience is very different, even if you could probably see many of the same components under a microscope. On the other hand, comparing the Girl Genius novels, not the webcomic, with Arcadia Snips and the Steamwork Consortium works. They're both comedic gaslight fantasy steampunk novels filled with mad scientists, strange contraptions, and political intrigue. They are of the same medium, the same genre, same purpose, and same basic ideas, even though they are certainly different products. Also, Arcadia Snips is relatively unknown, and I will put a link below. Please give them some love if you can. Now that I've established basic ideas I follow for comparing works, let's move on real quick. Vathek has no modern peers, because that was, by the way, the subject of the video that sort of sparked our conversation about it. I know of no one besides me who wants to write Arabian Nights style books. It's more than a setting, it's word choice, cadence, and a thousand other things. On the press channel, which I will eventually move this channel, I will actually be reading from my Sheik of Mars book and just read through it, and then probably pay someone to edit it. I don't know. I have someone in mind already, but it's more than just Arabian characters, by the way. It's love, poetry, wisdom, wonder, revenge, duels, hubris, and a sort of divine fate. It's more than the setting, even though it's very much a part of it. Therefore, because of an extreme lack of peers, I cannot say anything modern is better than Vathek. I fall short, even though I do believe I kept to the genuine vision, and I'll actually be making a video about where I believe I succeeded and where I failed with Sheik of Mars. Um, how about science fiction? I can say that science fiction of the past was better. Burroughs, Heinlein, Asimov, Hodgson, Parnell, Niven, Lovecraft, and even the works from the living Niven isn't really as good as his old stuff. Neuromancer and Snow Crash are like the oldest things of that generation that I kind of like, and it sort of cuts him off too, weirdly. The Birth of Cyberpunk cuts off the old stuff around late 90s, 87, 89. Excuse me, late 80s. Fantasy, it's the same sort of thing. Burroughs and Howard and Lieber and Tolkien and Lewis and Chesterton and so on. Some of these guys, MacDonald, some of these guys are cross genre, of course, and again, up to about 89. The year of my birth, I can say that there was fantasy worth reading, kind of. That's its own video. I'm not as big a fantasy as I am sci-fi. Honestly, most of the stuff that people write in the fantasy universe don't impress me at all. Um, but there is some sci-fi worth reading, and there are things that I enjoy, and that most modern stuff to the late 50s that I just don't like. Now, going to from 1990 to 2015-ish, we only have a few bright stars. Star Wars novels. John C. Wright and his wife get to start work. Saga of the Seven Sons is okay. I'm buying hardcovers of that. It was all right. Honestly, I only buy them like when I can get them for like $3. From secondhand stores. There's the Comic Bones, Girl Genius, Arcadia Snips, the first two Clockwork Century books, Parabolis, Aragon, but not the sequels of Aragon. No. High House, World War Z, Larry Correa, which you can see in this shelf dedicated to him. You could literally shake down my library and you could have a who's who of awesome stuff that was published when I was a kid and beyond. There's actually a weird gap in the 90s where I have, like, unless I'm doing something for a fandom or because something caught my eye randomly, I buy the highest quality goods I can get my hands on. But most of my stuff is old or written with old souls or, published new but really old stories. There's actually a weird gap in the 90s where I have basically nothing that was published. It picks up again for John C. Wright, Star Wars, and some other things like Redwall, but from which was published pre-90s. But I'm talking about like the same thing with Snow Crash and Euromancer. There's that gap. But Redwall books I love were published from the late 80s to the death of the author. There are two things that are necessary that are currently missing from the milieu, and that is time and the culture of quality. There's some bias to things that are remembered. In other words, the best survived over time. I have some books that are just not remembered. Vathek and the Argonauts of the Amazon and a couple of other pulpy things lying around are mostly forgotten. I love Vathek, but let's look at Project Gutenberg. It only has about, if you combine all the different copies that are on it together, about 400 views, 370-ish. The first Arabian Nights alone has 800, and collectively they're well over 2,000 views on Project Gutenberg, and that's not counting outside of it. There's like special editions bound in gold lying around the dusty ruins of Borders bookstores, and there's been dozens and dozens of reprints and versions over the years. I wouldn't be surprised if they over represent Vathek. I want to say 3-1, 4-1, 5-1 even. My Christian fifth grade classroom had a kind of safe for work version. It had way less racism and nudity. I kid you not. When I read the whole thing like unabridged, whew, I was like, "Ooh, spicy!" Whew. Issue like donkeys. Now, if I want Arabian fantasy like that, there's very little lying around. Assuming no shenanigans from the part of the algorithm, when I search for stuff like that, I'm only finding Arabian Nights and romances. In other words, Vathek dominates a sport that nobody plays except for like one or two dudes. Well, let's compare that to fantasy, like straight fantasy. There's Conan, Lewis, and Tolkien, and Elric of Melniboné, and Earthsea, which is like later on. But it kind of just falls off. It was a very long decline. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse are good, but not so good as Conan. Conan is good, very good, but does it really compare to some of the fairy tales I've read? The long ones, or from King Arthur's stories. Elric was good, but it was edgy. Like, the dude wrote it to be edgy as he can. Earthsea is worse than people remember. And you should never read books 3 or 4. And yet that's the one that sometimes that got the Ghibli movie. Anyway, as time goes on, we decline. Martin got famous on being shocking, but discounting the young adult trends that go up and down worse than a bubbled stock market, I can't find anything I really love. See, taking into account the split of urban fantasy, steampunk, and the other brother punk genres, modern fantasy actually tightens up quite a bit. Sales are down, corporate shops are closing, and the big four, once five, are in a slow decline. Tor is explicitly held up only by Macmillan Publishing's textbook sales, which are extortionate as shit. Martin Beck props up his backers with his sales, but nobody, like, I don't even know who publishes him. I don't care. There's nobody as famous as him running around in there. And I've read the first book of his, by the way. Now, there are exceptions within my library. I've mentioned Redwall. I've got the Pendragon Cycle, only the first 3 books. High House, which honestly wasn't popular. And few people talk about, despite being genuinely one of the best books I've read. There's also books like Aragon and Inkheart, which I don't own, my sister does, but I do love. And I'm not counting Aragon sequels. It's not like there were none. It was more that there were proportionally more books published and less books worth reading during that time. What's more, publishers started to hire and reward people based on non-skill based metrics. In other words, they moved from a culture of quality, from a meritocracy, to other standards, which honestly might be a bad decision when you have a work that whose quality goes up and down based on the skill of the author and nothing else. Sure, you can say marketing affects the sales, but I'm talking like, we're not talking like in the year. I'm talking like what happens when the author dies. When I die, will people remember Sheik of Mars? No. Yet, Jerry Pournelle dies, people still remember The Moat in God's Eye, and There Will Be War, and all the other things that he used to do. And same with Heinlein and Asimov and Burroughs and all that jazz, as much as they hate the people. You know. So, if you take a look at the various Hugo and Nebula award winners, starting from about late 80s to now, there's been a difference between guys like Asimov to people like N.K. Jemisin, who I wouldn't wipe my ass with a page from one of her books. When I was looking to publish my novel and for my novella, which is still unpublished, but whatever, I wrote, I found that many of them were not looking for accolades or experience or like a smart pitch meeting or anything like that. They were looking for things like diverse viewpoints, non-heterosexual characters. Essentially, they cared more for what a writer is rather than for what they can do. And we're seeing this more and more as they're getting crazier and crazier. What's more, it kind of leaks down into the work of art itself. Of course, it's not quite a problem back then, and it's its own thing now. But it's one of those things that grew over time. It was a cancer, and it metastasized. Let's take Star Wars as our case study for a few paragraphs. Star Wars had the height of Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy, and then it went all the way down to Karen Travis's Mandalorian /fic. Don't even get me started on Chuck Wendig. That butterball deserves to die in a fire. In fact, it could be taken as a metaphor at large. Zahn, I get so angry when I read anything by Chuck Wendig. You guys don't even understand. You have Timothy Zahn, Michael Stackpole, Aaron Alston, and debatably Kevin Anderson compared to Karen Travis, Troy Denning, and Chuck Wendig. The only Star Wars books that are remembered were written by the first 4, but the next 3 are dull, boring, and forgettable. They use subject matter, Game of Thrones tactics, and shock value to make things even slightly desirable. Anytime they need to bring back good blood to the series, they beg Timothy Zahn to come back and pay him whatever he wants, I'm sure. And he goes, Stormtroopers go rogue. Brilliant. Pre-Clone Wars colony ship with Jorah C'baoth and Thrawn origin story. Sells like gangbusters. I want to screw over the previous books by making different things canon and getting Luke married. Yeah, man, do whatever you want. You sell. That's literally why he wrote the Hand of Thrawn duology. And that's not even counting off. But by the way, read stuff and then like read the Hand of Thrawn duology. Like it's basically him bitch slapping the previous authors. And that's not even separating how authors are acting outside of their works of art. I don't really separate an author from their work of art. You wouldn't go to a restaurant that hates your guts and gets all your orders wrong, where each meal can cost over $20 a pop just for one item. Chuck Wendig is unpleasant as all get out on Twitter. He insults his fans and can't take criticism, and often mocks people who have different beliefs than him, which is completely unacceptable. Karen Traviss puts Mandalorian fanfiction characters into her works, and honestly, she hasn't done anything worth my remembering since the last Star Wars novel she wrote. Troy Danning, I don't know anything about Troy, but they can go to hell for the stuff that Troy writes, because they were basically the last novelists to work on the Star Wars EU, and then they canceled it. Now, it was pretty unwieldy, but it's one of those things where it's like, this is the quality of your work. These are the people you associate with. I assume that you're not any different from them. Sure, we can take people as individuals, but people gather with people that are like themselves. Timothy Zahn, though, he's a class act. He's wonderful. Stackpole, I respect that man. Aaron Alston, I have no clue. But I haven't heard of him being a pedophile, so he's already better than many of the sci-fi writers that are traditionally published. Start looking into their sexual mores sometime, like Isaac Clarke, the Arthur C. Clarke, there we go, who was one of the big three of the 70s. He went down to like Sri Lanka or something to feast on the boys there, who he basically prostituted for a while. I think he's dead, but really he should have hanged for the evil stuff he did, and that doesn't get into Marion Zimmer Bradley and others. Like there's a whole undercurrent of pedophilia in that cesspit. Isaac Asimov's son was one of the biggest pornographers ever rated, and they basically gave him a slap on the wrist. Like, there's so many messed up things in that mess, but that's not the point of this video. It's just something that messes me up. I'm getting distracted. Basically, we haven't had enough time to know what's truly great yet. Oh, and William C. Dietz, great sci-fi writer. Loved his Kyle Katarn books. But we have a good idea of what I'm talking about. Redwall is good as any old fantasy. 90s and aughts Star Wars is better than a lot of the old pulp stuff. Artemis Fowl, Girl Genius, and other newcomers just don't have the good comparisons, but they're great and entertaining. However, when applying like to like, it doesn't work so well, and often benefit from not having competitors or just being new and slightly better than the rest. And we can tell from the character of the authors being published that they have less devotion for the craft for its own sake, and more hatred for their fans of all things. Adding politics into the mix doesn't make a book better unless it's a book specifically examining politics. And this is very important. That's not entertaining to normies. Normies just want to be entertained with a good story. Back in the day, normies had great tastes. They were taught what was good. They knew that pulps were called pulps because they were cheap and the authors were desperate. They also knew that romances and stuff like that were very popular at the time, like Charles Dickens, was made for normies. It's why they have chapter-long death scenes for that cute coughing orphan child with a heart of gold. All that good stuff. But Charles Dickens survived, you see. So did Victor Hugo and others. And hell, I haven't even started to touch on the new stuff that was, zipping all the way to the other end of the spectrum. I haven't touched the stuff that was published in the last 3 years in this conversation. I just did a 9-part series on the first season of Galaxy's Edge, and I did that before I touched Phantastes on this channel. Timothy Zahn's Star Wars, Girl Genius, Dreadnought, and other books I really love. Are also on the docket, but they just haven't shown up yet, but Galaxy's Edge did. I think we're moving into the first steps of another golden age, or a pulp era of something. It's certainly an Amazonian golden age, but I don't own physical copies of most of the stuff being published. Some of them are just awesome action romps. Brian Niemeyer finally figured out how to write, not that he was struggling with it, I'm saying that in general people were struggling with it, how to write good mecha action. Barely anyone did that back in the day. It was all fighter pilots. Even though mecha would have certain advantages when it comes to space station and, shall I say, obstacle combat. And I'll talk about that later. It's weirdly important, but to sci-fi, but whatever. The things we remember from the past are always better because we have that lens of past enjoyment. I don't know why I didn't write that word down. They were certainly universally better when it came to genre fiction. It was rarer. People loved romances and normie garbage, and people knew how to write back then. Now, and of course, like you can say, well, anyone can write, but it's a certain lyricism, an ability to bring the pictures to life. You see, I can tell when someone doesn't have a muse and is just writing by rote. Most pornographers. Now, although we have so much choice, I can't read it all in this lifetime without abandoning all my other projects that I really want to see take off. And it's not necessarily different from each other or very well constructed per novel. And I want novelty. I want craft. I want my soul to be fed, and my soul is a hedonistic gourmand. Having bounty hunter Boba Fett knockoff kill 50 more dudes doesn't really work unless it's the best written shit this side of the Rishi maze. And that's what Nick Cole gives me. And he gives it to me often enough that I very much enjoy it. And you know, it's a very complicated issue, but like I said, no, but yes. Because at no point in time does the author's skill levels necessarily disappear. And in fact, you know, over time we should be kind of getting better. We could be, you know, instead of being whipped around by fates and politics and all that stuff, we could be focusing on the craft, writing until we create something that's actually worth reading. We have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein notes. The original, like pre-edit stuff, wasn't that good, but then it was edited into something that was amazing by her. And, you know, her husband read it, who was a poet, and like other people did it, and she's like, no. But then she, you know, did X and Y and all that jazz. You know, we can see how it was. But then Frankenstein, people remember forever. Horror people, H.P. Lovecraft people remember forever because he was simply the best writer of it. Hodgson is forgotten because he had the same similar ideas as Lovecraft, except more malevolent than uncaring, but he wasn't quite the same writer he was. Or there's things going into now. Who will survive? Who will be remembered? Yeah? And I'm very interested to see that. You see, we don't know who will be remembered yet. But I have some guesses. Nick Cole, Jason Onsbach's Galaxy's Edge series, me, you know, and all these other ones could be remembered. Rogue, I don't think well. You know, I don't think many of the generic space opera stuff that's really just set pieces will be remembered, or they'll be remembered as, you know, like the second Pulp Rev, or something like that, or the second Age of Pulp. You know, like where everything's kind of cheap and kind of crappy and kind of by formula, but everything is awesome, and it is. This is a great era to live in, even as it is a terrible era to live in, as always. Remember, we have toilet paper, and that's important. I hope this helps understand my perspective on how things go. Let me summarize real quick. Good was almost guaranteed by publishing for whatever genre it was until about the 1950s in Campbell. Now, Campbell was dedicated to providing the best from his own perspective, but that kind of backfired a little bit. Now, afterwards, we have a different culture, different types of books, and less pulp and more thought. That is after Campbell got started. Then, around the end of the 80s, early 90s, the decline begins for real. While we have some bright and shining exemplars, Redwall, etc., um, most just aren't good. Or just like the first book is good, like in Aragon or other things. Um, that's its own problem, honestly, because you spend 2, 3, 4, 5 years on one book, and it's amazing. Of course it is. And the second book, it's like, oh, I didn't have 5 years to work on this because they're begging me for another book because it's selling so well. Beginning around 2015 or so, things maybe 2014, things are starting to look up. And honestly, that's what I'm trying to focus on with this channel, while bringing some of the bringing up some of the old good shit that everyone should know and love and read, because it grows the heart and soul and mind and all that good stuff. We don't necessarily see that with the more, shall we say, blockbuster type pulps that we're seeing today. Thank you for listening, everyone. You're all very special to me. Chairman of the Hunter x Hunter Association, uh, and everyone else. Hope you check out the links I will put down below, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please, please, my family, they're holding it. No, I'm kidding. No, 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 no. Please like, comment, and subscribe for its own sake if you are pleased with my product. Thank you.